Way back in 1917, in a little district you might not even have heard of called Champaran, a fight over a blue dye, a dye, ended up changing the entire course of Indian history. This was the Champaran Satyagraha, and it was the very first time a powerful new weapon was really put to the test in the fight for freedom: nonviolent civil disobedience. So let's dig into how this one event became the blueprint for our revolution.
So you gotta wonder, right? How on earth did a local argument about farming a blue dye in Bihar explode into the first major victory for the Gandhian method in India? And how did it light the spark for a whole nation's freedom struggle? Now, if you're studying modern history, especially for exams like the UPSC, getting to the bottom of this question, well, it's absolutely essential. All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get to the root of the problem. Then we'll look at this really exploitative system called Kathia. We'll see what the final straw was, the catalyst for change. After that, we'll dive into the Gandhian method in action, which is fascinating stuff. And finally, we'll wrap up with the victory and its incredible legacy.
Okay, so to really get what was going on, we have to rewind the clock a bit. The story really starts way back in the 1760s. The British East India Company, remember they were still mostly a trading company then, started pushing for indigo plantations in places like Bihar, Oudh, and Bengal.
Now, you might be thinking, what's the big deal with growing indigo? Well, the farmers had some really good reasons to resist it from the get-go. For one, indigo was an incredibly thirsty crop. It needed way more water than their food crops, the stuff they actually ate. Even worse, it just wrecked the soil, sucking all the nutrients out and leaving it useless over time. And the kicker? All this backbreaking work was for a product that was just shipped off to Europe and China for British profit. The farmers themselves saw almost none of the benefits.
This anger and frustration wasn't just a feeling, It was actually written into law through this deeply unfair system. This thing was called the Kathia system, and it was the legal weapon of exploitation that would become the flashpoint for this entire revolution.
So what exactly was this Kathia system? The name itself actually gives you a pretty big clue. Kathia comes from two simple words: teen, which means three, and katha, which was a local unit for measuring land. So the name literally spelled out the rotten deal.
And here's how it worked. It's pretty simple, but totally brutal. Imagine you're a farmer, and you have a plot of land. Let's call it 1 biga. The system divided that land into 20 parts, or kathas. Now, the Kathia system legally forced you, the farmer, to grow indigo on 3 of those 20 parts. Sure, you could grow your own food on the other 17, but you had no choice about those 3 parts. It was forced labor, plain and simple, and the damage it did to their best land was a huge source of pain.
So this exploitative system just kind of chugged along for a while. It was awful, but it was the status quo. But then, around 1915, something happened halfway across the world, in Europe, that completely changed the game and made a bad situation for the farmers of Champaran a whole lot worse.
And that something was Germany. They invented a synthetic blue dye, and the economic shockwave was instant. Think about it. The German dye was cheap and could be mass-produced in a factory. Indian indigo was super expensive and took a ton of labor. Almost overnight, the global demand for Indian indigo just vanished. It completely collapsed. Now, you'd think this would be great news for the farmers, right? The crop nobody wanted to grow was now worthless. But no. The British planters, who are now facing financial ruin, they didn't just let the farmers go. They doubled down. See, they weren't just traders anymore. They were the rulers. They basically stopped paying the farmers or paid them pennies, but used their political muscle and police power to force them to keep growing this useless crop. This is the moment it shifted from just economic exploitation to outright brutal oppression. And it's right into this powder keg of a situation that Mahatma Gandhi arrives in 1917. He had just come back from South Africa, and he didn't show up with weapons or angry speeches. He brought something completely new: a method, a systematic, non-violent approach that was about to change everything.
And man, did his method get results fast. Check this out. On April 10th, Gandhi gets to Champaran with his team of lawyers, which included India's future president, Rajendra Prasad. Just 8 days later, he's arrested and standing in court. But then, get this, in less than a year, the entire system he came to fight is officially abolished by a new law. So, how in the world did that happen so quick?
Okay, this is probably the most important part of his strategy, so listen up. Gandhi's first move wasn't a protest. It wasn't a boycott or a march. It was a massive, detailed, evidence-based survey. He and his team literally walked from village to village, documenting everything.
They recorded the farmers' stories, their land records, their debts, creating this undeniable mountain of cold, hard facts.
And the sheer scale of this is just wow. We're talking about 4,000 detailed testimonies and case files. This wasn't just a crowd of angry people. This was a data-driven indictment. Gandhi was building an absolutely airtight legal and moral case that the British administration simply couldn't ignore.
Naturally, the British tried to shut him down. They ordered him to leave the district. He refused, and they arrested him. But what he did in court was pure genius. He didn't argue or fight the charge. He just stood there and calmly pleaded guilty, and then he gave this incredible statement. He said, "I have disregarded the order, not out of a want of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being, the voice of conscience." Can you imagine this act of peacefully admitting guilt, backed by thousands of farmers gathered outside? It completely paralyzed the British authorities. They had no idea what to do. They had to drop the case.
That moral victory right there in the courtroom, that was the real turning point. The government was cornered. They were facing this mountain of evidence on one hand and this brand new kind of peaceful resistance on the other. They were forced to act, and that set the final wheels of victory in motion.
And from there, the path to resolution was surprisingly quick and orderly. The government set up an official Indigo Commission to investigate the whole mess. And, this is the key part, they actually appointed Gandhi as a member of the commission. Of course, the commission's final report confirmed everything the farmers had been saying, and based on that report, the Champaran Agrarian Act was passed.
So let's wrap up with the legacy, because this is the stuff you really need to remember. First, the Tinkadia system was gone, abolished by law. The farmers actually got compensation for all their suffering. But the bigger picture is what's really important. This was the first time Satyagraha was successfully used in India. It launched Gandhi as a true national leader, someone who could connect with the masses. And it basically became the blueprint, the playbook for all the nonviolent movements that would follow. This event right here, this was the start of the Gandhian era.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. Was the incredible success at Champaran all down to one man's brilliant strategy, or was it about the collective power of thousands of ordinary people who, after so much suffering, finally found a voice and a way to fight back? It's a great question to chew on. Thanks for joining me for this one.